Hello, everyone. Hi. I'm delighted to welcome you all to the event today, a roundtable that will discuss the continuities between immigration detention and mass incarceration. This event is part of the series 50 Years Later, a series that marks the 50th anniversary of the passage of the 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act. The series highlights the varied and contradictory meanings that this bill has for different immigrant populations. Before I start, a short note. Please note that the event today goes until 1:30 p.m., unlike usual practice, and that we will reserve the last 15 minutes for Q&A. This event wouldn't have been possible without the help of many units across campus. So I wanted to start by thanking our generous sponsors, including the American Constitution Society, Asian American Studies, the College of Social Work, the Criminal Justice Research Center, the Department of Comparative Studies, the Department of Political Science, the Graduate Association of Latino, Latina, and Latin American Students, the Immigration Law Society, the Latino Studies Program, the Latino Law Students Association, the Mershon Workshop on Immigration and Global Justice, the Multicultural Center, and the Office for Diversity and Inclusion, and the Student Bar Association. This particular event crosses over from immigration to another area of US politics in which we see increasingly clearly the violence of the state: mass incarceration. Crucial in both of these realms is the question of race. While Mexicans and Central Americans are disproportionately targeted by the immigration regime, Black and increasingly brown young men are on the receiving end of the criminal justice system. This racialized violence does not end at prison walls, however. The recent instances of murderous police violence that characterize encounters between police and Black males and the lack of prosecution of those responsible for the lost lives provide sobering evidence of how much our livelihoods still depend on the color of our skin. This disregard for the lives of racialized others is also evident in the increased militarization of the border. The effect of this fortification has been to increase the dangers of the crossing, raise the likelihood that border crossers will encounter death, and empower border traffickers. A feeling of safety, mobility, and the ability to remain close to loved ones, regardless of the particular legal shape our emotional ties take, are all valuable features of life denied to racialized migrants in the US. Today, we focus on connecting two contemporary punitive realms: immigration detention and mass incarceration. The goal of this comparison is intellectual as well as practical. We expect to gain knowledge from the workings of these two realms to better understand the rationale and effects of these two forms of violent state intervention. On the other hand, we are hoping that this conversation will also serve to complement other thinking that seeks to facilitate alliances between organizers in both areas. Before introducing the speakers, let me call your attention to the posters that are exhibited outside the auditorium and were also playing on the screen as you were taking your seats. These posters, made possible by the work of Cathy Lu, an OSU architecture major, and Barbara Garman, a law student, seek to bring the realities of the US immigration regime to terms that all OSU students and faculty are familiar with: the size of the stadium, the size of the entering class, etc. The goal of comparing these two sets of numbers are many, but I believe that one is to convey that other groups have far less harmless familiarities to deal with. According to the polling firm Latino Decisions, 63% of Latino registered voters know someone who is undocumented, and 39% know someone who has been deported. This is up from 25% in 2011, bringing home the fact that as we speak, the immigration regime is expanding its reach and affecting in material ways more and more lives. To turn to our speakers, we are privileged to host today Professor Michelle Alexander, Professor César Cuauhtémoc García Hernández, and Ms. Silky Shah. To start in the order in which they will intervene, our first speaker is Professor César Cuauhtémoc García Hernández, who is an associate professor of law at Capital University Law School and a visiting assistant professor at the Sturm College of Law at the University of Denver. César's academic interests center on the intersection between criminal and immigration law, also known as crImmigration, and his work has appeared in the California Law Review, UCLA Law Review, BYU Law Review, Maryland Law Review, and Georgetown Immigration Law Journal, among others. His book, tentatively titled crImmigration Law, will be published by the American Bar Association in 2015. Professor García Hernández also publishes the award-winning blog crImmigration.com. Our second speaker, Silky Shah, from the Detention Watch Network. Silky Shah is the co-director of Detention Watch Network, a national coalition of organizations and individuals working to expose and challenge the injustice of the U.S. immigration regime of detention and deportation system. She has worked as an organizer on issues related to mass incarceration, racial justice, and immigrants' rights for over a decade. Prior to joining Detention Watch Network in 2009, she worked as an organizer with grassroots leadership fighting the expansion of immigrant detention centers in the US-Mexico border and at the independent news program Democracy Now! Our third speaker is Moritz College of Law Associate Professor of Law Michelle Alexander. Professor Alexander joined the OSU faculty in 2005 and holds a joint appointment with the Kirwan Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity. Prior to joining the OSU faculty, she was a member of the Stanford Law School faculty, where she served as director of the Civil Rights Clinic. Professor Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, is an account of the rebirth of a case-like system in the United States, one that has resulted in millions of African Americans locked behind bars and then relegated to a permanent second-class status, denied the very rights supposedly won in the civil rights movement. Since its publication in 2010, the book has appeared on the New York Times bestseller list for more than a year, been dubbed the secular Bible of a new social movement by numerous commentators, including Cornel West, and has led to consciousness-raising efforts in universities, churches, community centers, reentry centers, and prisons nationwide. I will now cede the floor to our speakers, who will offer a few opening remarks before starting a discussion facilitated by Professor Amna Akbar, as well from the Moritz College of Law. Thank you.
It's so nice to see so many people out here. Before we get started, I wanted to make sure Inés didn't introduce herself. This is Professor Inés Valdez from Political Science, and she's really the engine behind the event, so we should give her a round of applause.
Do you have any ideas? Oh, okay. All right. Okay.
Okay. This is it.
No,
No, it's not. Okay.
it's a PowerPoint slide.
Okay. It's on the desktop. Okay.
That one, yes.
Okay.
So,
Sorry about that.
okay.
And just hit. You want it full screen?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Great. So
Yeah,
it'll just
it's
come
one
up on. Okay. Great. Thanks. Well, thank you all for coming out here. And I want to just take a quick moment before I begin and thank both Amna Akbar and Inés Valdez for making this possible. I know there were a lot of other people who were absolutely integral to making this happen across campus, but Inés and Amna have really put in the lion's share of the work and done a great job putting together all of the logistics that are behind the scenes to bring me out here, and I'm very appreciative of their efforts, as well as all of you for making the time to be out here. So I've been studying the way that incarceration has become a routine, a normal, a natural part of our immigration law enforcement regime in the United States over the last several decades. And I want to spend a few minutes laying kind of a broad overview of what that looks like before we begin our dialogue in a few minutes. The state of affairs really is quite grim. Just to put it bluntly, there are now roughly 33,000 people who are sitting behind barbed wire on any given day because they've been accused by the federal government of violating some provision of civil immigration law. These are people who are confined in what we call the nation's civil immigration detention system. And over the course of that, of any given year, these 33,000 people a night will equate to roughly 400,000 or upwards of 400,000 people in a given year, as many as 478,000 people in fiscal year 2012. These are people who are not charged with having committed any crime. They're there because they're thought to have violated some civil provision of immigration law, something like you stayed here in the country after the 30 days or the 90 days that you had to come on vacation have expired. You just did not leave. And as you can see from this graph that's up here on the slide, on the screen, this is a historically unprecedented figure. Meanwhile, there are tens of thousands of others who are imprisoned every year because they're thought to have violated some provision of federal criminal law. That is, primarily two types of federal crimes, or two federal crimes. One is illegal entry, and the other is illegal re-entry. The first, illegal entry, is a federal misdemeanor that basically consists of coming into the United States without the federal government's authorization. Second is a federal felony that basically consists of doing that after having previously been deported. Because these are being prosecuted so much, immigration crimes are now the single largest category of crimes prosecuted in federal courts, numbering even more than drug crimes. They represent, in fact, almost half of all federal criminal prosecutions nationwide. In fiscal year 2012, to give you a little bit of a glimpse into the role that these prosecutions take in the composition of our federal detention population, the federal government arrested and booked into criminal custody 85,458 people who were suspected of committing a federal immigration crime. That's the data that this graph reflects. And I want to point out the fact that that immigration bar really towers over all of the next, including drug offenses. Now, as a formal matter of law, these populations are thought to be very different, and the processes by which these individuals wind up imprisoned are thought to have very little to do with one another. Nothing could be further from the truth. Their experiences reflect commonalities that I think make it best to think of this as not two phenomenons, not the phenomenon of civil immigration detention and criminal incarceration, but really a single phenomenon, the phenomenon of immigration imprisonment. All of these individuals are incarcerated because of migration-related activity. They would not be detained but for the fact that they crossed the border or because they committed some action related to that. And in addition, while some of this confinement is labeled formally, as a matter of law, labeled civil, and some of it is labeled criminal, the fact of the matter is that the conditions of confinement in many of these facilities are fairly similar. To house its civil immigration detainees, for example, ICE uses a network of about 250 or so facilities that are spread throughout the country. And many of these facilities are literally county jails that don't purport to be anything other than penal institutions. ICE essentially just rents bed space from the county sheriff. ICE also uses its own facilities, but those facilities quite often look and feel like prisons. They feature barbed wire, armed guards, controlled movements. And a facility, I want to illustrate this point, there's a facility that many of you may have seen in the news about a month, 6 weeks ago, that illustrates this overlap quite well. For many years, there's been a private prison company, the Management Training Corporation, that's run a facility in the South Texas town of Raymondville. This is in Willacy County, Texas, right in the southeastern tip of Texas. Back when I represented clients there, it held civil immigration detainees on behalf of ICE. These were people who were facing potential removal from the United States through the immigration court system. And at the time, it was called the Willacy County Processing Center. Then the investigative reporter Maria Hinojosa took a team of frontline cameras for the PBS show down there, and she essentially aired the facility's dirty laundry about all types of violence, including, most prominently, sexual violence. And eventually, DHS moved out its detainees. All of 1 month later, the Federal Bureau of Prisons began sending their inmates to the very same facility. Only now these were individuals who almost exclusively were convicted of having committed a federal immigration crime, illegal entry or re-entry. Now it's called the Willacy County Correctional Center because now it holds convicted federal criminals. Here's what the facility looked like back then when they were ICE detainees, civil immigration detainees. Here's what the facility looks like now when it houses federal criminal prisoners. It's kind of hard to see the difference. Actually, this was a picture on the right was taken about 6 weeks ago. It now doesn't have any detainees because there was an uprising about at the beginning of last month due to prison conditions. And the facility got destroyed in large parts, and so the Bureau of Prisons pulled out all of its detainees. And when all of the detainees left, all of the money that came with those detainees left. And what do you think happened after that? All of the jobs left. So now about 400 former guards are now former guards. Right? They're now struggling to figure out what they're going to do with their lives. What these images illustrate, I think, quite well is the fact that we're using the same enforcement method in response to the same migration-related activity, but sometimes we call it civil and sometimes we call it criminal, and at the end of the day, call it what you want, it looks a whole lot the same. So I think we should be thinking of this as a single population, one in which all of the folks that are put into the crosshairs of the government's coercive power because of their immigration status are thought of as the nation's immigration prison population. Only by looking at this population as a whole can we fully account for the ways in which incarceration is having a pernicious and punitive effect on migrant communities. So let me turn now to how the government achieves this level of immigration imprisonment. At the same time that Congress busied itself creating and expanding the war on drugs in the 1980s and early 1990s that folks like Professor Alexander have written about so lucidly and rather heartbreakingly in The New Jim Crow and elsewhere, Congress also busied itself building the legislative architecture for the immigration prison population that we now know. Let me identify just a few key pieces of legislation that were central both to the war on drugs prison population and immigration law enforcement's prison population. We had the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986. It was clearly by its name intended to target drug activity. It did just that. Crack cocaine, Congress decreed, should be punished by 100 times the amount of the severity of powder cocaine. But it also targeted immigration. It rendered conviction for any controlled substance offense a basis for deportation. And it codified a practice that, until very recently, just a few months ago, was at the center of immigration detention, the immigration detainer. Immediately following a subtitle on using federal buildings as prisons, the Narcotics Traffickers Deportation Act, Congress called it, the ADAA authorized state and local law enforcement officials to request that the now defunct INS issue a detainer for people arrested for any violation of a controlled substance offense and believed to be in the United States without the federal government's permission. 2 years later, Congress returned to drugs and immigration in the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1988. Congress was apparently running out of titles. And in the ADAA of 1988, Congress expanded forfeiture provisions that were intended to incentivize police participation in the growing war on drugs and a number of other war on drugs or policies that were central to the early war on drugs. Several provisions, though, also use immigration law and immigration law enforcement as a way of targeting drug activity. One section, for example, increased the prison term for illegal reentry after conviction for drug trafficking. But there was no provision of that 1988 law that was more significant than the provision that added the phrase aggravated felony into immigration law. Until then, that phrase hadn't been in immigration law. Since then, it's become an absolutely critical component of immigration law. And at the time, that phrase was defined as including 3 offenses: murder, firearms trafficking, and trafficking in drugs, suggesting that Congress, at the very least, thought that these should be mentioned in the same breath, if not that they were equivalent. Immigration officials, the ADAA added in a later provision, just a few pages later, were required to take into their custody any migrant convicted of that aggravated felony, thereby inaugurating the era of mandatory civil immigration detention that those of us who know about immigration law are quite familiar with. 2 years later, President George H.W. Bush signed into law the Immigration Act of 1990. And when he did, he declared, quote, that the law, quote, meets several objectives of my administration's war on drugs and violent crime. The entanglement between criminal confinement and civil confinement as a means to enforce immigration law had been born. It would take some time for these numbers to grow to the enormous figures we know today, but that legislative framework put in place in the early years of the war on drugs made that possible. I write about this on a weekly basis on my blog, crImmigration.com, so if you're interested in more about this, please go to that website, and of course, I look forward to the conversation that we're going to have and the questions that you may have later today. Thank you.
Yes. Good afternoon, everyone. Oh, there it is. It's so refreshing to be on a panel with César because I feel like I'm usually the person with like my soapbox of all that stuff, and now I don't have to talk about that. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about how we got to this point and the movement. But I'm really, really excited to be a part of this, and I want to thank Amna and Inés and OSU for making this happen, and for all of you for being here. I don't think it could be happening at a more pertinent moment. As we near the end of President Obama's tenure in office, the federal government has doubled down on its commitment to locking up immigrants at record rates and more than any other administration in U.S. history. As César mentioned, today, over 34,000 detention or jail beds are used for the incarceration of people with civil immigration violations. And immigrants who have been prosecuted for immigration crimes at the border, such as entry, reentry, and drug crimes, occupy another 25,000 beds, and just fewer than 500,000 people will be incarcerated for immigration-related infractions over the course of this year. The immigration detention system has rapidly expanded over the last 20 years. In the mid-1990s, there were about 8,000 detention beds. In 1996, Congress passed 2 immigration-related bills, the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act and the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act. These reforms meant that any non-citizen, including legal permanent residents, anybody who wasn't naturalized or a citizen by birth, could be subject to detention and deportation. And it also further limited the discretion of judges through the expansion of mandatory detention and mandatory deportation and aggravated felony, the category of aggravated felony as well. Just 2 years after the passage of the 1996 laws, detention capacity doubled to 16,000. The targeting of immigrants for detention and deportation continues. Hear me? Continues to expand. Yeah, I think it's okay. There it is again. The targeting of immigrants. Let me just turn this off. Okay, is this working? Okay. So, like I was saying, the targeting of immigrants for detention and deportation continued to expand throughout the last decade with the newly created Department of Homeland Security and Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE. And since 9/11, the focus on immigration as a national security issue has become deeply entrenched. Nowhere was this more clearly broadcast than in ICE's strategic plan from 2003 to 2012, Operation Endgame, which declared its purpose to be, quote, promoting the public safety and national security by ensuring the departure from the United States of all removable aliens through the fair and effective enforcement of the nation's immigration laws. The deportation regime reached new heights under the Obama administration, with the expansion of local police collaboration with ICE and through deportation programs such as Secure Communities and the Criminal Alien Program. ICE was able to coordinate with local police departments and county jails to funnel immigrants into the detention system, facilitating quick and efficient deportations. Federal funding for ICE has also played a role in determining immigration policy. In 2009, the late Senator Robert Byrd of West Virginia inserted language into the DHS appropriations bill requiring that a minimum number of immigrants be detained at any given time. Byrd, a former member of the KKK, was infamous for filibustering the Civil Rights Act of 1964. As Senator Byrd rose in power within the Democratic Party, he tempered his anti-Black racism to stay in line with his party. His anti-immigrant racism, however, remained unchecked until his passing in 2010. The language, which is now referred to as the immigration detention bed quota, currently states that funding made available under this heading shall maintain a level of not less than 34,000 detention beds. This incentivizes a need to fill these beds and, in turn, drives ICE to find people to detain and motivates them to not release people they would otherwise release. The concerted assault on immigrants and their rights has engendered growing resistance. In 2006, when immigrant communities feared the worst with the potential passage of the radically xenophobic and draconian Sensenbrenner bill, they came out in the tens of thousands in what became some of the largest marches since the Civil Rights era and the Vietnam War. However, the movement against the Sensenbrenner bill was precisely that, a defensive rejection of the bill. It lacked a broader racial justice framework for understanding the immigration question in the United States, and as a result, common slogans heard at the marches were, "We are not criminals," "We are innocent," and even "We are not terrorists." In the aftermath of the 2006 marches, energy was rapidly devoted to the passage of comprehensive immigration reform. As a parallel effort, the reintroduction of the DREAM Act in 2009 helped build the grassroots base of undocumented youth who soon became the voice and symbol of the movement. However, the primary concern was legalization for those without status. Immigrants with criminal convictions were not only the first to be thrown under the bus, everyone loves that term, but they were often seen as a direct obstacle to reform. While the movement continued to exclude support for immigrants with past criminal convictions, the impact of heightened enforcement and racial profiling at the local level started to be felt more broadly, and soon the detention and deportation dragnet could no longer be ignored. The movement began to shift and take stronger actions with dreamers coming out of the shadows and supporting broader reform and standing up against the stigmatization of their parents who brought them. Local communities waged successful campaigns against the rise of deportation programs at the local level, leading to a cat and mouse game with ICE that ultimately led to the demise of Secure Communities. And a series of actions involving civil disobedience at detention centers across the country demanded not one more deportation, raising the profile of the issue after over 2 million immigrants had been deported under the Obama administration, and underscoring the role detention plays in the deportation regime. Incarcerated immigrants also took a critical leadership role by waging hunger strikes at detention centers across the country, with one of the largest taking place last spring at the Northwest Detention Center in Tacoma, Washington, in which 1,200 immigrants participated. And as César mentioned, more recently at the Willacy County Correctional Center, a former detention center now used exclusively for those prosecuted for immigration crimes, 2,000 of the 3,000 immigrants held at the facility led an uprising that not only dismantled the structure itself, but led to its closure just 2 weeks ago. In the face of swelling popular pressure and given the failure of several attempts at passing immigration reform under his tenure, Obama's hand was finally forced, and on November 20th, 2014, he announced that he was taking executive action on immigration. It was a calculated move. With less than 2 years left before the next presidential election, President Obama was thinking of his legacy and the viability of the Democratic Party in 2016. The action provides expanded relief for dreamers and undocumented parents of U.S. citizen children, and it would benefit roughly 4 to 5 million of the 12 million undocumented people living in the United States. Unfortunately, the action also includes, not surprisingly, increased militarization at the southern border and a revamped and potentially harsher system of targeting immigrants who don't qualify for relief. The president clearly stated, we're going to keep focusing enforcement resources on actual threats to our security, felons, not families, criminals, not children, gang members, not a mom who's working hard to provide for her kids. The statement not only conceals the fact that the detention of Central American refugee women and children is expanding through the resurrection of family detention, which had been all but been done away with in 2009 after popular protest. But the deepest problem of all is the ongoing criminalization of immigrants and the unchecked culture of xenophobia that enables the president to make such remarks. It's no coincidence that prisons are the answer here. The drive to criminalization runs in tandem with the wider culture of punishment in the United States that has targeted people of color and poor people and led to mass incarceration on a globally unprecedented scale. Recently, ICE went even further in a preemptive surrender to Congress by announcing a new policy that further limits any release of immigrants with past criminal convictions. As the tide has finally begun to turn on the issue of mass incarceration in the U.S., thankfully, the incarceration of immigrants is only expanding. It is critical now more than ever that any movement fighting for migrant justice supports and works in partnership with those fighting to end mass incarceration and criminalization of communities of color.
Well, good afternoon. I'm thrilled to be here, and I want to just start out by thanking all those who helped to make this panel possible today. I think this conversation about the intersections between mass incarceration and mass deportation and the criminalization of immigration generally is among the most important conversations we can be having right now. I think it's absolutely essential for us to connect the dots between these crises, the crises of mass incarceration and mass deportation in the United States. I believe these crises are the most pressing racial justice challenges of our time. And I think it's been made clear already, so much of what is occurring today in our criminal justice system and through both of these regimes of racial and social control is largely out of sight, out of mind. The notion that 2 million people could be deported during Obama's administration is something that is difficult even to get your mind around. We have 2 million people incarcerated in the United States today, and we have 2 million people who are forcibly removed from their homes and shipped back to other countries. And yet all of this happens largely out of the conscious awareness of most mainstream Americans. If these phenomena are not directly touching you, if you don't have a family member, a loved one, a sister, or a neighbor who has been forcibly deported or is currently incarcerated or has been branded a felon or an illegal, then it's easy to go through your day, through your life, and really have no idea what is going on. This scale of deportation and incarceration that is happening here in the United States is staggering. And I think until you actually see some of these enormous prisons and these compounds, as you showed up on one of your slides, and see the scale of what it means to simply restrain forcibly millions of people or remove them against their will, I think unless you actually see it for yourself, it can be difficult to believe. Not long ago, I actually was asked to give a talk at for the class of one of my sixth graders during my daughter who's a sixth grader, during Black History Month. And they wanted me to kind of talk about how much progress has been made in the United States and, where must we go from here, the usual narrative that's required on Black History Month and during Black History Month. And, during the discussion, I encouraged each one of them to reflect on whether they felt, slavery or Jim Crow in and themselves were, immoral, and whether people who lived back then had to have known that they were unconscionable and immoral. And nearly all the sixth graders said, well, yes, not only is slavery and Jim Crow immoral, but it must have been obvious to anyone who lived back then that those regimes were immoral and racist and horrible. And so we had a conversation about how it could be that something so horrible be going on and just be accepted as a matter of routine in our daily lives. And I asked them, is it possible that anything could be going on today that violates people's basic human rights, their basic sense of humanity, and is on the scale of something like slavery or Jim Crow? Could anything like that be happening today? And several hands went up, and students started talking about ISIS, and about terrorism in the Middle East, and a number of other students raised their hand and said that they knew that women were, denied the right to drive in some Muslim countries. And these sixth graders were remarkably educated about the denial of human rights in the Muslim world and violence that was perpetrated by terrorists and by ISIS, but could not think of even one example here in the United States of the large-scale denial of basic human rights. And since that experiment in that classroom, I have been asking the question of adults as well, and I find that the level of ignorance is pretty much on par with the sixth grade classroom. And so I think part of what we're here to do is not only to expose and to describe how these systems of racial and social control function, but the ways in which our collective denial has aided and abetted these systems, and what is necessary if we are going to build the kind of movement that will dismantle both of these regimes. In recent years, I have come to believe that the future of American democracy itself may rest on whether we rise to the challenge presented not only by mass incarceration, but also by mass deportation and the criminalization of immigration in the United States. It seems to me that the challenge presented by both of these phenomenon are much the same. Both of these systems of control, at the core, function to define who belongs and who does not, who is worthy and who is not, who is a full-fledged citizen or not, who is something less than a full citizen, far, far less a felon and illegal, someone not even worthy of basic civil and human rights. Now, it might sound like an overstatement to say that the future of American democracy rests on how we respond to mass incarceration or mass deportation, but I don't think it's overreaching. Mark Maurer, who is the executive director of the Sentencing Project and who wrote a wonderful book entitled Race to Incarcerate, published in his book the results of research showing that the most punitive nations in the world are the most diverse. The most lenient, the most compassionate nations in the world are the most homogeneous. It seems that it may be an aspect of human nature to respond with a punitive impulse to those who are defined as the others. And so it should not perhaps come as much of a surprise that a wave of punitiveness washed over this country on the heels of the civil rights movement. As segregationists found that they could no longer call for segregation forever, they began making demands for law and order. And a Get Tough movement was born, and a literal war was declared on poor communities of color. At precisely the same moment that economic collapse was happening in inner city communities across the country. In the 1960s and the 1970s, work was disappearing in the United States due to globalization, deindustrialization, and technological advancement. Factory jobs were vanishing from cities not only like Detroit and Chicago, but Los Angeles and even New Orleans and beyond. Industrial work was vanishing. Hundreds of thousands of people in urban areas found themselves trapped in segregated, jobless communities struggling for survival. And we could have responded to this wave of joblessness and hopelessness with bailout packages and economic stimulus programs. But instead, we ended the war on poverty and declared a war on drugs. And the backlash against the civil rights movement coalesced as both parties found that it was politically profitable to use racial code language, like cracking down on criminals and welfare recipients, in an effort to win back the so-called white swing voters, the voters that had defected from the Democratic Party in the wake of the civil rights, defected from the Democratic Party in the wake of the civil rights movement. And so through the Southern strategy and other deliberate efforts, those voters were targeted through subtle and not so subtle racial appeals. And a wave of legislation, not only in Congress, but in state legislatures, flowed that authorized harsh mandatory minimum sentences, even for minor drug offenses, sentences harsher than, even murderers receive in other Western democracies. And this impulse to be punitive, purely punitive, can be explained not so much by changes in crime and crime rates, but more as a reaction to the fears, anxieties, and resentments, particularly among poor and working class whites who were anxious, resentful, fearful, as they were suddenly forced to compete on equal terms with this whole new group of people they had been taught their whole lives to believe were inferior to them. And this state of affairs created an environment in which politicians and the public at large, rallied around the get tough mantra and a penal system unprecedented in world history was born. I say all of that because there are important political parallels between the birth of mass incarceration and the birth of the detention regime that we now see housing people who are suspected of crossing the border illegally. The same sort of racially divisive politics and fear-mongering that was evident during the early days of the Get Tough movement and the war on drugs is now pervasive and not even well-coded and disguised. And this is true not just on Fox News, but of course in mainstream media outlets as well. Politicians feel very comfortable saying it is important for us to get tough on them, crack down on those who are in the country illegally. And there is a lot of fear, particularly among poor and working class whites, that jobs are being stolen from them, and that it is due to, the dark-skinned others who are coming across the border and who pose a threat to them and to their way of life. And this fear-mongering and the exploitation, the deliberate exploitation of racial divisions during a time of economic insecurity and greater class divisions and heightened economic inequality, those are the ingredients that led to the birth of mass incarceration in the United States, and also have once again laid the foundation for mass deportation and the criminalization of immigration in the United States. And so I think that as we document with all of our statistics and data about the rates of increase, both in the number of people who are being held behind bars or in some form or another of detention for immigration offenses. We have to keep in mind that the core impulse is the same, that the impulse to punish for even the most minor offenses very harshly and on a scale really unimaginable in our history comes from a common source. And I know there are those who believe that as America becomes more diverse, increasingly non-white, that it will necessarily become more progressive. But history suggests that's not necessarily the case. The punitive impulse may, in fact, intensify as our nation becomes more diverse, and new forms of the divide and conquer impulse may manifest itself not only politically but within our communities as well. So I know we've got to get to our discussion here, but I want to just throw out there a few of the commonalities that I see between mass incarceration and the criminalization of immigration, as well as some of the challenges that exist as we move forward in our efforts to build a movement to end both. Well, the first, as I've just identified, is that both mass incarceration and mass deportation are born primarily of racially divisive politics, fear and anxiety about the others, racially constructed others during a time of perceived economic insecurity. Also central to both is the dehumanization of those who are labeled as illegal or labeled as felons. Once someone is labeled a felon or a criminal, they're summarily stripped of basic civil and human rights, including the right to vote, the right to serve on juries, the right to be free of legal discrimination in employment, housing, access to education, basic public benefits. Basic human rights no longer apply to you once you have been labeled a felon. And a similar process exists for those who are labeled illegal. Once it is determined that you are in the country illegally, then suddenly you are deemed no longer worthy of basic human rights and could be separated from your children, from your family members, and denied kind of basic dignity and humanity that would otherwise be extended as a matter of course. And that although neither of these systems were born initially from a profit motive, mass incarceration now has become hugely profitable. But the birth of mass incarceration cannot be traced primarily to a profit motive. It can be traced primarily to a deliberate effort to exploit racial divisions. But once it became clear that a killing could be made off of caging human beings, private prison companies emerged and a whole host of other private interests coalesced to find new and creative ways to profit from the caging of human beings. And the same can be said with the criminalization and mass detention of immigrants. A profit motive is not the primary impulse for responding to immigration with a get tough orientation, but it is now, the profit motive is now a primary driver of the expansion of detention systems in the United States, particularly in the South. And you see private prison companies lobbying for example, the Arizona racial profiling law and lobbying for the construction of more detention centers, and private prison companies have lobbied against reform of mandatory minimum sentences because they make money only when more people are behind bars. And so we must, as we build a movement to end these systems, contend not only with the racially divisive politics and the real economic insecurities that exist and are so easily exploited, but also with the fact that the system is now deeply enmeshed with private companies who have a stake in them as well. And then the fourth similarity I would like to identify is that the escalation of both of these systems occurred under Democratic presidents. President Bill Clinton escalated the drug war far beyond what his Republican predecessors even dreamed possible. And he did so in large part in order to try to win back those so-called white swing voters who had defected from the Democratic Party, particularly in the South. And President Obama has escalated deportations beyond anything anyone would have dreamed, 10, 15 years ago, in part to prove how tough he could be on those who violate the law by crossing into the United States illegally, while at the same time trying to do what he can to win over Latino voters who are, quite clearly becoming more influential in our political system. And so I think in building a movement, we must be aware of these realities, not only the fact that they are bipartisan in their construction and creation, but that the presidents who presided over the greatest expansion of both of these systems were, in fact, Democrats. Now, a couple of the challenges I'd like to just highlight, a few of them already have been, is that there will be some real obstacles to building a common movement to end mass incarceration and mass deportation if those within the immigrant rights community embrace language, as was discussed earlier, such as "we are not criminals," "we are not them," the others. That type of language and framing makes a unified movement next to impossible. The reason that these systems, I believe, have been so readily embraced by the public at large, aside from the fact that they've been out of sight and out of mind for the most part, is because they are predicated on this notion of unworthiness, that some people are unworthy because they are wrong. And because you crossed into this country without the proper documentation, you are illegal, you are wrong, we no longer have to care about our treatment of you. Because you sold marijuana in a state where it's not legal, you are wrong, you are now a felon, and we can strip you of basic civil and human rights that apply to others. In building this movement, I feel we have got to embrace a human rights framework for our work, so that we understand that certain basic human rights apply to each and every one of us, no matter who we are, where we came from, or what we may have done. That if we fail to move towards a human rights framework, we will consistently see efforts to pit aspects of our communities against one another and to carve out groups of humans who are unworthy and who can be denied basic human rights and stripped of basic dignity. I like to say we're all criminals, that we should all acknowledge the wrongness of ourselves and others, that none of us can claim not to be a criminal. If you're an adult, you've broken the law at some point in your life. And what defines those who are stripped of their rights and those who are not isn't who are criminals and who are not, but who's been caught and who hasn't, and who has been treated as though they are not worthy of any care, compassion, or concern. And the last challenge I'll identify is simply the real and quite obvious one, that as our nation becomes more unequal economically, as well as more diverse racially, the temptation will be great for politicians as well as folks within these movements to find themselves competing either for scarce jobs, scarce resources, or for status in a society that is so rigidly hierarchical, both on economic and racial lines, and finding ways to build and preserve solidarity across lines of race, class, gender, and every form of difference will be essential if we are to build the kind of movement that not only ends the drug war or the current crackdown on immigration, but helps to break the cycle of creating these enormous systems of racial and social control in America. So thank you so much for your time. And I look forward to it.
Okay, so I know the normal law school events end about now, but we are going to be going till 1:30. I'm going to ask a couple questions so we can have a bit of a discussion, and then we'll open it up for questions from the audience. So I wanted to start basically where Professor Alexander left off, thinking about the movement questions. What do we do about these intersecting regimes of social control? So Professor Alexander talked a little bit about the kinds of challenges making those connections we face, and the need to make those connections. Of course, this is a moment in the country of intense vitality of racial justice movement work. So I wanted to start by asking Silky about, you run an organization that works with immigrant rights advocates around the country. What kind of connections are already being made between the immigrant rights movement and the Black Lives Matter movements and related organizing in the country right now? Okay, do you want to come up here?
Yeah, I mean, I think, in a way, I mean, I think there's one piece of it that I think has really galvanized people is, you can talk about mass incarceration, you can talk about the expansion of detention centers, but prisons are largely invisible. We don't see them, we don't have to interact with them, and that's why it can continue to go on. And I think the increase of police-ICE collaboration and also the sort of attention with Black Lives Matter on police brutality and the relationship that police have with people of color has been such a galvanizing element to just really, getting people to rise up and fight back. And so I think that that's a parallel that we see that obviously is a part of that continuation and that continuum of apprehension to detention or incarceration, and for immigration to deportation. But I think, on the ground, there's no question. I mean, tons of folks who are in the immigrant rights movement went out to Ferguson and have been making these connections at the local level and trying to figure this out. And I think it's been an important moment for the immigrant rights movement to acknowledge that while it hasn't been a movement for racial justice for a very long time, it's really important that it moves in that direction. And so I think that we're starting to see that, and that's a really exciting part of the work, but there's definitely a long way to go.
I think we could actually have a very interesting conversation about whether and how the question of mass incarceration is coming up in the Black Lives Matter movement or not, and what the conversations kind of around that are. But I'm going to bracket that for a second. Whether or not it's happening in the mainframe or not, there has been a rise of this idea of prison abolitionism in the United States in the last few years, with increasing critical attention on mass incarceration. And I don't know for the law students and lawyers in the room how familiar that idea is. So since we're having a conversation about mass incarceration, mass deportation, and the detention criminalization of immigrants, I thought it would be useful to maybe think a little bit about the idea of abolitionism and what role it is playing or should be playing in our conversation. So I wanted to give that to either Michelle or César, whoever wants to kind of take that on first, and the other person can piggyback as well.
Sure. Is this not on? Is it on? Okay. Well, I mean, I think the short answer for me is that I consider myself a prison abolitionist in this sense. I believe we should end prisons as we know them, as sites of dehumanization, often torture. I believe we ought to be recognizing solitary, prolonged, indefinite solitary confinement as a form of torture in the United States, as a number of other countries do. So I think prisons, as we know them, must end. And, I think it would make no sense to talk about reforming the system of slavery to make it a better, more humane system. Can we reform the Jim Crow system so it's more equal but still separate. I think we have to think seriously about ending prisons as we know them and ending the system of mass incarceration as a whole. And so I think an abolitionist, the language of abolitionism is absolutely important. I do at the same time think we have to acknowledge that some people in our communities need to be removed for a time. And that people who live in communities where they have real fears for their basic safety have a human right, a basic human right that must be acknowledged, a human right to safety and security, to be able to walk to school without fear of being hurt or being shot. That is a basic human right as well. And how do we, ensure the safety and security and dignity of people of all colors and communities, while at the same time honoring the dignity and humanity of those who have caused harm to others? It's a difficult question. I don't think it's an impossible one for us to wrestle with and to answer. And what's clear, though, is that the current system of mass incarceration and our prison systems are designed to be purely punitive sites of dehumanization and control. And that, I believe, must end, which is why I feel very comfortable thinking of myself as an abolitionist.
Can I build on that? I think that when it comes to immigration, imprisonment, that one day, it would be nice if one day people received the same right to move as bananas. If it were possible for people to move across borders, because that's where their skills were needed and that's where they were loved. If that's where their families were and that's where their particular abilities were wanted. That's the reality that we have today, only we criminalize it, only we punish it through the civil system or through the criminal system. We spend billions upon billions of dollars building literally border walls that are literally made of concrete and steel. Right? We then spend billions upon billions tracking people down in our communities, despite the fact that they are firmly embedded in our communities, despite the fact that we all benefit from them being firmly embedded in our communities, not because we are trying to marginalize them out of existence, but because we want them to be marginalized. I aspire for a world and I dream of a world in which that doesn't happen. And if that dream makes me an abolitionist, then I am an abolitionist. In one respect, discussing immigration law violations is very different and much easier of an argument to make for abolition than in other forms of crime. Because what we're talking about here is, at the end of the day, movement of people. It is a violation of a regulatory regime. It doesn't hurt people. It's hard to find the tangible harm, either on property or on humans. Right, we are talking about coming to the United States in violation of some statute enacted by Congress that says don't come here unless we let you come here beforehand. Right? That's a simple regulatory violation. It doesn't harm you or me. It doesn't make us, it doesn't make our communities any less safe. And therefore, justifying depriving somebody of their liberty is that much harder. How do we justify denying somebody of their liberty to live with their families and to work and to make a life for themselves simply because they crossed an imaginary line? Right? That's what we do, and yet we don't really have a good justification for why we do that. An alternative that I think is really concerning to me is the push to expand alternatives to detention in the immigration context. We can go around slapping ankle bracelets on people. We do this in the criminal system. And one of the things that we've learned from doing this in the criminal system is that that's a great way for people to violate the terms of their release, of their supervised release. And once they violate the terms of their supervised release, we can then point to them and say, look, we gave you an opportunity and you screwed up again. All right, we've given you 2 chances. The first time when you were out good. Second time when you were out on this permission that we gave you. You are just a no good person. So we're going to lock you up. We can do that in the immigration system. We've got the private prison corporations that already know how to slap ankle bracelets on people, and they already know how to find those people to throw them back into jail. They're called GEO Group, they're called the Corrections Corporation of America, and they're making plenty of money off of this already in the criminal system and in the immigration system. So my concern is that when we're advocating for a reduction of immigration detention, if we do so by simultaneously advocating for an expansion of alternatives to detention, what we are doing at the end of the day, in reality, indirectly, is really advocating for an expansion of detention. Because we're going to end up with more violations of those supervision orders, which then allow us to justify throwing people back into jail. So if that makes me an abolitionist, then I'm an abolitionist.
Sorry, this is awkward. So just to piggyback off of Cesar's point, so President Obama in the fiscal year 16 budget that came out in February actually added 30,000 more spots for alternatives to detention, and these are mostly ankle monitoring programs, so it'd be 50,000 in total, and we talked, and it's basically, and we see no reduction in detention, in fact, an expansion of the number of detention beds from last year's budget, so I completely agree with that, and just to sort of underscore, I want to tell just a really quick anecdote, to underscore the relationship between sort of the history of racism in this country and these policies. So I have a friend, Ravi Rugbir, who was on an ankle monitoring program. He was in detention, and then he was on electronic monitoring ankle shackle program multiple times over the years. And at one point, he got married, and him and his partner were going out to Rockaway Beach. They live in New York for their honeymoon, and they were driving. They didn't realize they were leaving one county and going into the other. And when they were driving across, the ankle monitor started talking to them, and it said, "You are leaving the master zone, you are leaving the master zone," and it just kept repeating that over and over again. Ravi and Amy were freaked out, naturally, and came back in to the county, and it said, "You're entering the master zone, you're entering the master zone." So I think the deep-seated sort of, in terms of the experience on these ankle monitoring programs is by no means an alternative. It's an alternative form of detention. It's not an alternative to detention. And I completely agree that the fear that I have is that as we move in this direction of hopefully less mass incarceration, is that we just have a larger system of surveillance of people of color.
Okay, so we have about 10 minutes for questions. Are there questions in the audience? Yep.
Which aspect of it are you referring to?
Well, I think in the context of immigration,
Right, the question was about provision in the National Defense Authorization Act for indefinite detention. In some sense, the question of how detention in the national security context or arguments about national security and indefinite detention relate to these questions.
there's a long tradition in immigration law of detaining people who are suspected national security threats, and long existing authorization to do so based on secret evidence that isn't turned over either to the particular individuals or to even courts, even judges. So in one respect, I'm not familiar with the particular provisions that you're referencing, but in one respect, this is a long available power that exists in the immigration context. It may be that it has seeped over to the traditional criminal law enforcement context in the aftermath of September 11th. This is exactly the kind of thing that happens.
Other questions? Yep.
Do we know of anything that's happening in the policy world to really be talking about the types of reforms that we need? Because I know there's a lot of, I know both of these worlds as an organizer, but when it comes to pushing for reforms, something that's more inclusive, right, where we're trying to hit both at the same time. And I'm wondering, does anybody know of anything like that, or the funders that might be trying to pull those things together, because we've done a lot to work on the left and the right, getting the business community to work with the, we've got these broad expansions from the left to the right, but when it comes to the two camps coming together on policy, I'm wondering if there's
That's a great question, and I don't know in terms of policy, a particular policy that is currently being advocated with the specific intent of kind of having a win for both those who are doing immigration work as well as those who are focused primarily on criminal justice reform work. But I think one area that holds some potential is around the drug war, which, you know, I find that many people aren't as familiar with the international dimensions of the drug war as they are with the domestic, but certainly the crisis that exists in many Latin American countries as well as Mexico in terms of, you know, the killings that have been occurring there and the level of violence that is due primarily to the drug war that we have funded and pushed and insisted upon being waged in those countries, which, you know, also has real immigration consequences for the United States. Many people who immigrate to the United States would love to stay in their home countries if they could live there safely and peaceably in their communities, and partly because of drug wars that we have funded and promoted in those countries, it is not possible for them to do so. And so I would hope that, you know, there would be more, you know, collaboration among folks who are working around, you know, immigrant rights work as well as folks who are doing criminal justice work to view the ending the drug war, the global drug war, as a priority for helping to ensure that people can live peacefully where they choose. That it's not about trying to prevent people from coming to the United States, but recognizing that one of the consequences of the drug war is forcing people from their homes, you know, into a country that they might not otherwise choose to live in. And you know, everyone would be much better off if we, you know, take a route of, you know, ending these wars and making it possible for people to remain in the countries they choose.
Can I respond to that
Yep.
as well? So I think, you know, one of the places, it's not happening enough, and I think in the immigration context generally when it comes to policy, most of it at this point is defensive. It's really a scary fight that we have going on right now, and so unfortunately it's mostly defensive. But I think at the state level in sentencing reform, I do think there are some potentials, and one example is the passage of Proposition 47 in California, which did have immigration consequences that were positive. There's a lot of problematic around Proposition 47 for a lot of reasons, which I encourage folks to look out just in terms of the way that campaign was won. But I do think, you know, one of the things that happened in this relative to sort of how aggravated felonies work and mandatory detention and deportation is that some immigrants now warrant, you know, misdemeanors were 364 days, which would not put them into the mandatory category. And so immigrants were being impacted by it in a positive way. And I think as we see more of that happening at the state level, there could be some potential for more collaboration there.
So we're about time, but I want to take, there's two hands up, so I'm going to ask both of you to ask your questions. There were two last hands that I saw up, so I'm going to ask both of you to ask your questions, and then we'll have the panel respond to both of them. So you and then over there. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I just want to ask, I'm Reverend Stanley. I am the president of Ruby Granny in Springfield, Ohio, and we came together because of the John Crawford murder at Walmart. I'm also part of Black Lives Matter for John Crawford in Green County and Stop the Mass Incarceration Network of Dayton, Ohio. And I want to know, how can we come together? I know Michelle said that we can all come together, united, so we can make a big stand like Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King did in Washington, D.C.
Okay,
Couldn't
and
get
then,
the last part of what?
oh,
How we can come together as Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King did in Washington, D.C.
okay, and then over here.
My question is, how do you think that widespread marijuana legalization will affect these workers, and how do you think it will affect people who've been disenfranchised by the law?
Okay, so why don't we just each of you take a turn, and whichever questions you want to respond to, go ahead.
Okay, with respect to marijuana legalization, I think I'm a strong supporter of marijuana legalization. I think it's insane that we criminalize the use or sale of a substance that is now shown to be less harmful than alcohol or tobacco. And, you know, countless lives have been destroyed or, you know, badly damaged by being arrested and incarcerated and branded a criminal or felon because you were caught with some amount of marijuana. So I'm a strong supporter of legalization. And I think that it will mean that many, many young people of color will not get funneled into the system, at least it's not as young of an age as they otherwise might have been, and so that the impact is significant and real. On the other hand, legalizing marijuana has already been shown not to address the problem of racially biased drug enforcement. Just a couple days ago, a study showed that in Colorado, marijuana legalization did nothing to address racial disparities in marijuana arrest and enforcement. Although marijuana is legal for a certain percentage of marijuana, a certain quantity of marijuana, if you're producing it under certain circumstances and not using it in public places. So there's a regulation regime around the legalization, and racial disparities in who's being arrested for being in violation of the legal use of marijuana have actually increased since marijuana has been legalized. Now, the total numbers of people who have been arrested are down, but the racial disparities in terms of who is being arrested, of the small number of people, remain and have actually worsened. And so, you know, there's arguments now about why that's the case. Is it because of, you know, the high level of police presence in poor communities of color that necessarily you're going to have continuing racial disparities or not? But I think marijuana legalization is going to have, you know, a positive impact in communities of color, but racial disparities will persist. And I'm very much concerned that marijuana legalization is going to lead to big business in which primarily wealthy white men benefit, and that I would hope that the benefits of marijuana legalization would instead flow to the communities that have been most harmed by the drug war and criminalization. And I have not yet seen, you know, legalization regimes constructed or proposed that would ensure that the benefits of legalization and much of the money made actually goes to repair the harm caused by criminalization. So I'm a supporter for reparations for the war on drugs, and I believe that legalization should be a step towards, you know, repairing the harm that has been done, not simply, you know, benefiting those who, you know, are already wealthy and are in a position to take advantage of a new legalization regime.
Can I respond to, with the Colorado perspective? So I live in Denver. I'm a big fan of legalization. Big fan of legalization. The smell of the neighborhood has literally changed. On top of the fact that something like 40% of sales are to out-of-staters, so tourists keep coming. Our education system needs the tax money. At the same time, though, there is obviously the fact of the matter is that this is a regulatory regime that is that has been built on top of an existing and unequal policing regime, right? One in which we over-police communities of color. One in which, as Michelle says, Professor Alexander said, you can smoke all you want at home, inside. Right? But when you don't have indoor places, private places to do that, because of where you're living, you have a small space because you can't afford more, for example, and you do so outside, then you're doing it in violation of the law. And I have to say, and I'll admit that there is less tolerance now for doing that than there was even in the past, right? Because now you can, the perception is you can do so legally so very easily, except you can't if you don't have anywhere to do it because you're living with a large number of people at home, or you're kind of in an unstable housing situation, and that will continue to affect communities of color. So I think it's highly problematic. I mean, it remains problematic, and yet I think is a really positive step forward. In terms of the immigration law part of this, it's still a violation of federal immigration law. to engage in that activity. So if you leave the country and you're trying to come back in, heard anecdotal information from attorneys practicing along the border where their clients are being asked whether, if the clients who live in Colorado, are being asked whether they have actually smoked marijuana. Clients, migrants, are trying to be honest, and knowing that it's legal to do so in Colorado, say yes. What does that make? That makes you inadmissible to the United States. No amount of state legalization is going to do that. That's a congressional issue.
I'd also like to address the other question real briefly. Oh, thank you. About kind of what it will take to build the kind of movement that's necessary. And I mean, I hope we have a whole other forum just on that question, because I think that is the question. You know, how do we go about building a unified movement that encompasses all of these groups and kind of picks up where King and others really left off? One thing I will say about that is, unlike the position we were in as a nation, you know, in the 1940s and, you know, into the 50s, where if you wanted to join the movement to end the old Jim Crow, there were organizations that were grassroots, national organizations you could sign up to join, and you were part of the movement. Today, I find that it's very difficult for people who say, I want to be part of the movement, to know where to go or what to do. You know, in the 1960s, as the civil rights movement was really gaining steam, you had the NAACP, which was back then a radical organization. You know, it was a radical organization. You would risk your life by having your name on the membership rolls for the NAACP in many states in the South, which is why the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that those membership rolls didn't have to be released to the public. And so, you know, you had the NAACP, you had SNCC, you had CORE, Congress on Racial Equality, which had, you know, chapters all over the United States and on college campuses. You had the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. If you wanted to join the movement, you knew where to go, kind of where to sign up and to join and what you were getting yourself into. Today, there is not a single national, grassroots, membership-based organization that exists to end mass incarceration in the United States. There's not one, not a single one. Now, of course, there's many organizations that are doing great work. You know, all over the country, I meet people who are part of organizations doing phenomenal work. But we do not yet have the infrastructure that once existed, so that if you wanted to join the movement, you could. And most of the work that gets funded today is top-down, grass tops kind of work. It's the work that gets funded is, you know, research work, think tank work, grass tops organizations. This is not to discount the important work that the ACLU and the NAACP and these organizations do, but those organizations do not have as their focus ending this punitive systems that have been created in the United States and dismantling them. And I would hope that as we begin to build this movement, that a lot more creative thought will be given to how do we begin to build capacity in communities that have been most impacted to organize and to mobilize and connect with one another nationwide. Thank you.
Okay, so we are out of time, but join me in thanking our wonderful presenters. And I also want to thank all the administrative staff that helped make this event possible. If you want to continue the discussion, we are having a reception with food and some drinks in Lou's Cafe, which is right across the hallway, the coffee shop at the law school. So please join us there to continue the conversation. Thank you.
Yeah, I think